All right, so I think this is working. Um, I am doing this for the first time ever, so I hope that this is advantageous or that it works, I should say. Um, so bear with me. This is going to end up as a recording on the Biomed YouTube channel, and if this ends up working out, then it'll be a resource for us to use in the future. But if it ends up not working out, I might just make a more traditional video um, here like I normally would on the channel, but thought this might be helpful. And one of the reasons I thought this might be helpful is because I would encourage you to either send me a message via Slack or via my email, my school email, so michael.burke@hcps.org. If you have any questions as we go through the video, I'll be able to answer them that way. Have the comments turned off for school reasons. So I know it's a little bit convoluted to send me a message through some other channel, but this way, instead of having to do our meeting here or to do the lecture here, saves us some time, saving having you to log into Teams, and it would be a lot harder to find the recording and stuff like that if we did it through there too. So you're going to see me through a couple different things here. I have 3 different scenes that we'll be going through. So the first thing here is that our presentation will have me down here in the bottom corner, and I'll walk you through some of the stuff. If I need to, I'll pop up full screen to try to explain or demonstrate something, but this video should go pretty smoothly and shouldn't take much more than 20 or 30 minutes. So I hope this helps explain some of the things from 4.1.2. And it looks like we have a couple people here, so I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for being here. And the first thing to explain with the joint motions that a lot of people get confused by, especially when they were working on the packet and doing things with the shoulders, which will come up later, is that we want to think about the body, always think about the body in anatomical position. So what that means is standing straight up, facing forward, your hands are down by your side, you're standing feet shoulder width apart and stuff like that. We always are going to have to kind of flip the body around in our heads to think about what is that joint actually doing. And it takes a little while for you to get used to that kind of a mental model, but it's helpful for kind of deciphering some of these situations. And we're going to start with some of the simpler ones, and we're going to go through a bunch of different examples here to help you understand. And so I had my son help me out here last week. We went out on the driveway and took some pictures of the different body motions. And so I have the joints that we're focusing on each slide. I have that circled with a blue circle, and we have a before and an after. So that's the other thing to think about with all these joint motions, is that when you're doing them, your body, we always have to think about the chronological order about what the motion is doing. So to move the elbow from being straight down by your side to being up by your shoulder is called elbow flexion. So let's go back to that for a second and look at the slide again. So elbow flexion, elbow, obviously the joint we're looking at is the elbow, which is why it's circled. But we call it flexion because the joint angle is getting smaller. If you think about the bones here in kind of simple terms, you have your humerus in the proximal part of your arm, and you have the ulna and the radius at the bottom. And the elbow, they make an angle, like a simple angle that you would have in a geometry class, right? This is essentially, 180 degrees. It's straight out. It's a straight line that your body makes here in the before angle. And then when you bend that elbow up, you're making the angle smaller. So that's, you would say that's probably like 45 degrees or something. So we went from 180 to 45. We went smaller. So that's a joint angle that's making a lot of sense to say that that's flexion. That's a smaller angle, so it's called flexion. So that was elbow flexion. Moving here, moving to the hip. And so with the hip, when he raises his knee, that makes the hip angle that's from the upper body going to the hip joint and then going down the femur. So that angle was 180 degrees in the before angle, and now it's 110, 100 degrees. So that angle has gone down, so it is called flexion. So this is hip flexion. This one can be a little bit confusing. So the before and after pictures here, we're looking at the shoulder, and this is if the shoulder raises straight out in front of you and all the way up to your head. So if you were kind of like asking a question in class or something like that, and you raised your hand straight up. So this joint angle, we're looking at the shoulder again, and by lifting that arm straight up in front of us, that is shoulder flexion again. So shoulder flexion, we're making that angle smaller, going from being a straight line all the way up to 0. So this goes from 180 to 0. We made the angle smaller. So this one is also the shoulder, and this is where things can get a little bit confusing, is with the shoulder joints. The hip joint a little bit too, but mostly the shoulder is the most confusing of the joints. So looking at this one, we have a midline through the human body called the median, and when you take that that shoulder, you take the arm and you move it away from the midline, which is what's happened here from the before and the after. Moving it away from the midline means that the body, the shoulder, is abducting, like aliens abducting you and taking you back to their planet, taking the midline, the arm away from the midline, which is what's happening here. It got raised up and away to the body, and the hips did the same thing here because he did a jumping jack. But that is called shoulder abduction. And we'll talk about the opposite of that later, I think. But to bring that back in would be ADD, adduction, which would be the opposite of this. So this one can be confusing too, and this is the one that I get the most questions about when people are working on the packet. So if you think about how the shoulder is interacting, so the scapula is interacting with the humerus here in this ball and socket joint. When the humerus is pivoting inside of that joint, which is what's happening here, when your arm moves from inside to outside, when it opens up like that, you can do that right now as you're watching me. When you do that, you can feel the humerus is up and down, and it's opening, it's pivoting back and forth inside of that shoulder joint. So that is not flexion or extension or abduction. That is a rotation. So the humerus is rotating inside of that joint. And when you are taking the humerus and the hands and you open them up like he's doing there, the humerus opening up is going to be called lateral rotation, because if you look at how the hands go, the hands are going away from the body. That helps us see this here in this example. But anytime the shoulder is rotating in that same way, anytime that humerus is moving in that same way, it would be shoulder lateral rotation. So with shoulder lateral rotation, in the picture, in the packet, it's like this. And I'm moving my arm forward and backward like this. Or I'm not. An aide from last year is. But the idea of moving like this, the hand doesn't get closer or further away from the midline, but that doesn't matter. This is where we go back to thinking about the body in anatomical position. Doing this motion is the same as doing this motion, going like that. My shoulder and my humerus are working together in the same way. So that's going to be, again, my shoulder is doing, in this case, what I was just describing actually was medial rotation, like moving it in, but moving it out is lateral rotation. So here with the hip flexion, or sorry, here with we have knee flexion. So the knee is moving and the knee angle is getting smaller. So flexion doesn't always mean going forward. So again, that's knee flexion. So a lot of people sometimes get confused by the fact that the arm moving in this direction is flexion and the shoulder moving forward is flexion. But flexion just means the joint angle is getting smaller, and so legs are oriented differently. So this is still the shoulder getting, or the knee angle getting smaller. So that's called knee flexion. And so reversing the order of the pictures from before. So with arm straight up and the arm coming down, that is shoulder again. So shoulder, but instead of being flexion, this time is an extension because we've taken that angle of all the way up, which being 0, and moving it down. We're extending the angle from 0 to 180. So that is shoulder extension. And then so the same thing's happening here, reversing the pattern of the shoulder, the elbow, having a small angle and having a large angle. So now that is elbow extension. And here we are starting with our arms out and then moving them back in. So that is shoulder medial rotation. And then so the hip is having a smaller angle, so looking at his torso and going down his leg, so that angle is smaller than straight up and down. So we've gone from before being a smaller angle to after being a larger angle, and that is hip extension. So there are other special joints that have their own special names and movements. Scapulas can elevate and depress, and the jaw can do all kinds of different motions too. But here, the ankles have their own special motions that are referred to more often than some of the other special motions. So let's talk about that one. So we're looking at the ankle, and when the ankle, the way I remember it, this one is when your toes point, when they go down. So the angle between the shin and the toes gets larger. I think about like the plants are in the ground, pointing my toes towards the ground is pointing to where the plants are. I don't know, whatever motion, whatever mental model works for you. That is ankle plantar flexion. And a lot of times you'll see people just take out the ankle part and just say plantar flexion because it's, again, a special motion that I think only happens in the ankle. So saying ankle plantar flexion is a little bit redundant, but just trying to fit the pattern of everything else we've done. And then doing the opposite of that, taking the ankles back towards your shin, or sorry, taking your toes back towards your shin is going to be called ankle dorsiflexion. So you're moving the ankle, you're moving the toes towards the dorsal side of your body, towards the back. You're bringing them back. So that's dorsiflexion. So with the joint motions, and what you hopefully noticed is that basically all of them have a pair. So we have plantar flexion, then we have dorsiflexion. We have flexion, we have hip extension, and then if I go back far enough, I'll find, hip flexion. All of these joints, all these different motions, have a pairing, and so by doing these motions kind of by having them paired up, that helps you remember. In my mind, it helps me remember them mostly by saying, if I could remember what flexion is, I can remember what extension is. So all I have to do is look at the joint and say, oh, that's the knee, so the angle is getting smaller, so that's knee flexion. I don't have to memorize each one if I can remember all the different parts. Just like with the anatomical terms we learned before, is that I can assemble kind of on the fly. If I have the basics, I can figure out what you mean by saying, dorsal side of your antecubital region, or you can put those pieces together in your head and figure things out. And so hopefully this video helped you a little bit with that. If you have any questions, again, feel free to ask them by emailing me or sending me a Slack message, and I can answer them right now. Or if you want to do that later, I can answer your questions later individually. But hopefully these pictures help give you an extra understanding or reinforce your understanding from your work that you were doing before. But knee flexion, hip flexion, all of these different things are how we describe how the body's moving. And when we measure them, which we're not doing right now, but we can measure these with something called a goniometer, and that is a very helpful tool for a physical therapist to be able to track a patient's progress from a surgery recovery or something like that. And it's a very common way that for mobility issues to be diagnosed and have recovery be tracked. So knowing these terms, knowing what the different obviously knowing what the joints are is pretty easy, but knowing what those different terms are can also help us inform other things to know that, well, if the person's having trouble with elbow extension, then we need to maybe strengthen the muscles that do elbow extension, which is stuff that we'll learn about in 4.2. So those muscles would be things like the triceps, which are involved in extending the elbow joint. So knowing these terms is helpful not only in diagnostics, but also in treatment plans and things like that too. So again, feel free to ask me any questions if any of those come up. And I appreciate you allowing me to experiment with a new technology. I've never done a YouTube live stream before, so I don't know how helpful this has been or what it's looked like from your perspective. My internet here is not phenomenal, so I don't know if this is all coming through like it's being transmitted from a potato or not, but it was interesting to try to get set up, and I appreciate you allowing me to do that and to provide you some instruction that way. Again, make sure you check the email that I sent out at the beginning of the week, which is probably how you know about this, and make sure you're getting things done for all of your classes, but contact me if you need help with anything or have any trouble with anything going on. Till next time.